but we can really clue in on this range and the wall part of it. And the way that I simplify is, you know, who do we have more range against and who do we have less range? And like we get outranged by the ballpoint, so they have more range than us. But the zap, the brush, the slosh, they all have less range than you. So if you know that you don't have to worry about the ballpoint, or if you can put yourself in fights where you don't have to worry about the ballpoint, then, you know, you always want to keep your distance and you always want to just, you know, keep as much space between you and the enemy as you can. And then the other thing with like the verticals and the walls. So like for the verticals and walls part of it, Zap has a harder time. Ballpoint definitely has a harder time. But I think brushes and Tri-Slosh do better on the walls than you. You know, if you have, again, this is all contextual, because if you have, you know, if you know where they're at and they don't know you're there, then definitely play off of the walls. And I think you did a really good job of finding opportunities for you to you know, drop down on someone and throw burst bombs or go for the dunk. And you were very effective and able to stop a lot of pushes with it. Like this fight that you took over here when you were like jumping into little puddles and you sharked in this area, and then their Tri-Slosh came swinging around this way. Like this is contextually, when it comes to the range and the vertical with the wall, this is an example of you're not in an optimal range against the Tri-Slosh, or basically any weapon that was still alive on the enemy team. And then if they took this alternative approach, which a lot of sloshes will, where they climb this wall instead and you're still sitting here, then they win this vertical part of it as well. And then you're double in trouble. When I'm in a fight and I see what's visually in front of me, or I look at the UI and I see which enemies are splatted, then I can play the fights and I can position in a way that's a little bit more favorable for me. Nailing the context is tough, but it's something that you should be practicing every single time, and you'll get better and better at it, and you'll be faster at it. So we are looking at this stamper here on the blue team. And the first thing that I like to do is kind of go over comps. So Rainmaker on this map is a little weird, but one of the advantages of playing Stamper on this map is that we get a lot of really good angles and we can play ledges pretty well. Not as well as something like Tri-Slosh. Tri-Slosh is very dangerous. Brush is a little bit scary as well when it comes to dealing with ledges. You have to be pretty crafty with how you use your Zipcaster, so we'll see how creative we get with our angles. But we do have enough resources to be able to be in a good spot. Looks like the enemy team didn't go for the pop, so you know, if it's there, we take it. The initial drop here is a little bit scary. And mechanically, you know, this is something you'll get more comfortable as you keep, you know, practicing and everything. In a lot of spots, you can totally hit this play, and I think this drop is totally fine. But if you want to make your life a little bit easier, you can lead with a burst bomb and paint their feet so they have less of a time moving afterwards. And I like the constant mobility. I think it keeps you alive in these types of scenarios. And your team's able to clean up most of the rest. This is the spot where ballpoint gets a little bit scary. So when ballpoint's sitting in this kind of spot and our team's trying to push them, ideally we don't want to all push from top mid. If we all come across the top, the ballpoint can actually get a bunch of splats, and that's kind of what we see here. It could have been way worse, but this should be a lot cleaner from us. Because you're in this kind of spot and because you can play ledges better than most of your team, instead of climbing back up this wall and pushing this way, because we know there's just the ballpoint left, I'd much rather us take a wider approach just so that we have another angle in order for us to fight this ballpoint. So if you want to, you can go onto this left trench. We can climb up their main ramp wall and flank around this way. Alternatively, we can also just use this back street, climb up the wall this way. We're a little bit more hidden. And as long as we're fast enough, the enemy team isn't going to respawn in time, and we should totally, like, our timing window, as long as we act and start moving forward faster, we'll be in a good spot. Ballpoint doesn't have the opportunity to chain a bunch of splats together, which they almost do. They stop Rainmaker and they get 2. Fortunately, y'all are able to... Oh, they get 3, actually. So yeah, y'all had a really good push opportunity. I think your teammates needed to play it a little bit slower as well. But, you know, then getting into the habit of taking these side routes. And going up this right side's fine as well, but you were already, you know, you dropped down on the left side after you got your splats and everything. So, you know, just keeping on the left side would probably make the most sense. I think we can probably contest mid a little bit more. We might give up too much space, but I understand that you're the last person alive, so I can understand your concern. Any potential fights that we take are against things that we very favorably outrange. So because we know we win the range battle against these, even though on paper it's a 1v3, you can play a lot more, what I consider like you can play bigger in the fact that you can just like sit up here and get a vantage point of what the enemy team, like where they're trying to position and what they're trying to do. You can check to see where they're coming from, which these are probably the most obvious routes. Sometimes they may drop over here, but there's no paint, so we don't have to worry about that. And we can use our range when we're, you know, up high and zone them out and keep them kind of stuck in this area. And the longer that we can hold these types of zones, the easier it is for the rest of our team to make it in. When you sit back like this, the enemy team is able to just move forward and take mid for free. I don't think you need to play as scared as you end up doing. Because we can see from their perspective, while you're getting this paint, they're able to get the pop. They're able to push up. And now your team, so your teammates, if you held this spot, at some point, if they keep pushing you and you feel uncomfortable, you can always move back at us, you know, once you start feeling uncomfortable. Hold this space as long as you can. Because at this point, because you backed up all the way here, your whole team is fighting from this main ramp area. And this is very scary. Because they have complete control of mid. And you have to deal with Ballpoint sitting on top mid, doing what you were potentially able to do before. We're having to all fight from the same direction. We got our dunk, let's go. Good job continually backing up there. That's unfortunate with the whale. It's good that you got first checkpoint. Ideally on this map, and it very much depends on a lot of scenarios, you don't necessarily know where the enemy team is outside of the brush because of where they use their whale. But if you can dunk it on the ramp versus dunking it down here, in a lot of cases, doing it on high ground is going to be a lot more advantageous and will lead to a more successful push on average. We don't have the lead, but it's still very, very early and we got checkpoint, so we're chilling. Yeah, jump's totally reasonable. And again, they're 3 down here. I want you to take space. It's extra important to take space because we're playing against the Ballpoint. I mean, like, Ballpoint is a bad matchup for us. So we want to take the extra time that we have now with the enemy team splatted for us to be able to play around these walls a little bit better. It's like, you know, dropping off this way and, you know, finding alternative angles and not having to take a straight up fight with the Ballpoint, because that can really slow down your push. The person that's respawning, when they jump in, they can pick up the Rainmaker and you're still going to get a push. And I think you're effective enough with your Stamper. You probably get a way bigger push than you end up doing, picking up Rainmaker yourself. Nice. Yeah, and this is also a little small scenario. Like in these types of spots, especially against a brush, like you're in a great position. You probably can't sit on this ledge because if the brush jumps at you, they can definitely splat you and probably will splat you before you're able to splat them. But, you know, I much prefer your positioning up here, or, you know, you can also move up here if you'd like, but I think you're totally fine where you're at now. And even if it takes you a little bit longer to get the splat, you have more options and your probability to stay alive is a lot higher in this scenario. Regardless of if it's the tri-slosh coming through or if it's the zap coming through, they have the faster kill time than you. And you don't want to take these like close quarter fights because you can't outrange them when your back is against the wall. So I'd much rather you move up this way. You could move up this way, but the other thing with brush, which they are splatted, but the tri-slosh specifically, is if they didn't round the corner, if instead they climbed up this wall, then they have height advantage over you and they can just slosh down on you, and it, you know, you're in an even more miserable scenario. So while you're hopping away, you can check the UI, and seeing that this ballpoint is down, it simplifies the fights that you take during this little segment until they respawn, because you outrange the rest of these enemy teams. So you want to keep as much distance from them as possible. So I think this is okay. Pickup's debatable depending on who you ask, but I think it's totally fine. I don't think it's like throwing or anything. The one thing I would say, I'll let it play. The one thing I will say, if you do pick up Rainmaker in these positions, is putting it in a spot that isn't throwing the game if you get splatted. If I was you, I would probably stall Rainmaker in like this area. Because if you get splatted here and your team still has control of top mid, it's really hard for the enemy. Like, they have to take fights and position themselves in really awkward spots to be able to not only pop the Rainmaker, but to be able to actually push it after. If you want to sit around this ledge, I think that's reasonable. But once you feel like you're in a pretty comfortable spot, you may want to look to drop down and like play this area. And just keep the Rainmaker in like an awkward spot for the enemy to be able to, like, it's easy for you to protect the Rainmaker in this spot, and or just like in this spot, but you know, in this area, it's easier for you to protect it. Because yeah, getting splatted here, if this fight, like if the fight after the splat goes wrong and the enemy team comes out with an advantage, they can pick up the Rainmaker and they don't have to push it very far for a lead. Versus if you got splatted down here, they have to pop it, they have to climb up this wall, they have to go across this way, and then they're in that same spot, which gives your team more time to react. So it's kind of a safeguard to position farther away from in like these more awkward spots. And our goal here doesn't need to be we need to stop the Rainmaker immediately. We just want to be in control. And we want to put ourselves in situations where we have advantages. So again, going back to not being out in the open and taking fights against the ballpoint, and not being super close to walls and not knowing where, you know, the brush is potentially. Zap isn't really much of a problem, and luckily Tri-Slosh has a Rainmaker. But you don't necessarily need to play this aggressive here. Because you're pushing so much farther than the rest of your team, if you get splatted by yourself, it just leaves there to be a more like some sort of opportunity for the enemy to actually win this game. And when you have a lead like one, you just want to play like super chill, but a very solid game. We got the dub. We love to see it. So the first thing here is the blank screen. So number one, the best way I'm going to say it is like context. And this is why I go over the roles before every match, before we do the review, because that same type of thought process, granted you don't have a ton of time, but you should be thinking about what your role is, and, you know, comparing your weapon in context to the other weapons in the match before every match that you play. It'll make your life so much easier and it'll simplify a lot of decisions. But we can really clue in on this range and the wall part of it. And the way that I simplify is, you know, who do we have more range against and who do we have less range? And like, we get outranged by the ballpoint, so they have more range than us. But the zap, the brush, the slosh, they all have less range than you. So if you know that you don't have to worry about the ballpoint, or if you can put yourself in fights where you don't have to worry about the ballpoint, then, you know, you always want to keep your distance, and you always want to just, you know, keep as much space between you and the enemy as you can. And then the other thing with like the verticals and the walls. So like for the verticals and walls part of it, Zap has a harder time. Ballpoint definitely has a harder time. But I think brushes and Tri-Slosh do better on the walls than you. You know, if you have, again, this is all contextual, because if you have, you know, if you know where they're at and they don't know you're there, then definitely play off of the walls. And I think you did a really good job of finding opportunities for you to you know, drop down on someone and throw burst bombs or go for the dunk. And you were very effective and able to stop a lot of pushes with it. Like this fight that you took over here when you were like jumping into little puddles and you sharked in this area, and then their Tri-Slosh came swinging around this way. Like this is contextually, when it comes to the range and the vertical with the wall, this is an example of you're not in an optimal range against the Tri-Slosh, or basically any weapon that was still alive on the enemy team. And then if they took this alternative approach, which a lot of sloshes will, where they climb this wall instead and you're still sitting here, then they win this vertical part of it as well, and then you're double in trouble. When I'm in a fight and I see what's visually in front of me, or I look at the UI and I see which enemies are splatted, then I can play the fights and I can position in a way that's a little bit more favorable for me. Nailing the context is tough, but it's something that you should be practicing every single time, and you'll get better and better at it, and you'll be faster at it. But there's a lot of different scenarios where you ended up dropping, or like you were, I think up here, maybe up there, but you ended up dropping down into the trench and put yourself in a tough spot because you don't have a lot of paint. Stamper is a weapon that it can paint really well. Like when you're able to paint these long trails for your Rainmaker, or if you have an opportunity to kind of just chill and just like paint a bunch around, like you can get a lot of good paint output, but you put yourself in vulnerable spots where you didn't necessarily need to. That's kind of the biggest thing. The other thing that you'll definitely want to keep in mind, take space and look for what I would consider creative angles. So what I mean by that is when at the very beginning of the game, when you got splats and you ended up in this spot, and the ballpoint, you technically don't know where they're at, but you can say based off of sounds and paint and just general map knowledge and awareness, that ballpoint's somewhere in this area. And when the rest of your team is up here, this is where like I'd rather you take those more creative angles. You know, off angle, another way of thinking about it. But push at least this way when the rest of your team's going this way, so at least there's two different directions. But because you're already like down here, I actually really like you being able to like flank behind. You can make your decision if you want to go that way, or you can go that way, or you can take this wall. The timing window is a little bit tough for you to go this far away because the enemy team's going to spawn in and start spotting you. But, you give yourself a lot more opportunities to make it really hard for the ballpoint to clean everyone up versus 4 of you all bunching up and the ballpoint ended up taking out 3 of you. So like, let's say, if Rainmaker's sitting in mid and your team's going for first check and you got 3 down or you wipe them, instead of helping with the pop and, kind of being slow, if your teammates are already around the Rainmaker to pop it, just like sit up here, like navigate your way to like hold this spot and hold the top of that ramp before the enemy team coming out of spawn is able to get there, then you should definitely take the opportunity to do so, because you'll already be up here and you'll already be firing your long range shots on the people on this ramp. And if you keep the enemy back here, your Rainmaker can just, bunk the Rainmaker for checkpoint for free. Those timing windows are, it's another way to think about the game. Splatoon is definitely a game of time. We'll give you a second to look at your stats. Dropping a 20 bomb, let's go. So again, thank you for the quote. Much appreciated.